The carriage wheel cracked clean off its axle, and Duchess Serafina Whitmore went flying into the mud before 300 watching nobles. Nobody moved to help her. That was the first sign of how cruel this town truly was. She pushed herself up on her own arms, gown ruined, chin bleeding, and laughed. Not a small laugh either. A real one, loud enough to turn heads. While the crowd gasped in horror, she looked up at the toppled carriage and said the wheel had more dignity than half the men in this courtyard, because at least it knew when to fall apart honestly. That was the moment Duke Thaddeus Brockwell stepped out from behind his own line of guards and looked at her properly for the first time. He had buried 2 wives. He had bowed to no woman since. Every lady in this county learned to curtsy and speak softly around him, because his silence could end a family's standing in one evening. But for Serafina, she did not curtsy or even try to stand straight. She simply asked him, mud still on her hands, whether a duke who let a woman fall in front of him without lifting a finger truly deserved the bowing everyone gave him. Tell me honestly, would you have bowed to him after that, or would you have laughed in the mud with her instead? I want real answers under this video, not just hearts and emojis. And tell me where in the world you're watching this from tonight, because I read every single comment myself. If you think she's about to lose everything for that one sentence, hit subscribe right now, because what the Duke does next changes both their lives forever. The mud on Duchess Serafina Whitmore's hands had not yet dried when Duke Thaddeus Brockwell reached her side. He did not offer his arm right away. He simply stood there, studying her face, as though she were a puzzle nobody had warned him about. "You find this amusing," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. "I find it honest," she answered. "Mud does not pretend to be anything else. People in this courtyard cannot say the same." A few nearby guests pretended not to listen, but their necks stretched toward the pair. Like flowers turning toward sunlight, they could not resist. An older woman near the front row watched with sharp and calculating eyes, leaning close to whisper something to the lady beside her, a gloved hand covering her mouth, as though that might disguise her interest entirely. Serafina noticed the attention, but refused to let it shrink her posture, even slightly. The Duke finally extended his hand. Serafina looked at it for a long moment before taking it, allowing him to pull her up from the mud. Her gown was beyond saving, streaked brown and torn at the hem, yet she stood as though she wore the finest silk in the kingdom, rather than ruin clinging to every seam. "Most women would weep," he said, his eyes moving briefly over the damage done to her appearance. "Most women have not buried their pride the way I have," she replied. "Weeping over mud seems like a poor use of tears, when far greater things deserve them." Whispers spread through the crowd, like water, disturbed by a falling stone, except this was no fire, only words, sharp and curious, passing quickly from mouth to mouth across the courtyard. Everyone in this town knew the Duke's history. 2 wives, both gone within a handful of years of marriage, both quiet, both obedient, both remembered now only as names carved carefully into a family tree. Nobody dared question aloud. Serafina knew this history too. She had heard it whispered by her own aunt the night before the ball, a warning wrapped tightly in concern that Serafina had received with far less alarm than her aunt had intended. "He will swallow you whole," her aunt had said, gripping Serafina's hands, as though the contact alone might anchor her niece's reckless spirit before it carried her somewhere dangerous. Men like him do not fall in love. They acquire wives the way they acquire land, carefully, deliberately, without sentiment clouding their judgment for even a single moment. Serafina had laughed then too. She seemed to laugh at most warnings given to her, not because she failed to understand danger, but because she refused to let fear choose her path before she had even walked a single step of it herself. Now, standing before the very man her aunt warned her about so seriously, she felt something unexpected stirring beneath her ribs. Not fear, curiosity. sharp and undeniable, the kind that refused to quiet itself, simply because caution demanded otherwise. "You did not answer my question," she said, brushing mud from her sleeve with little success. "Did you deserve the bowing they gave you tonight?" The Duke's jaw tightened visibly. Nobody asked him such things directly. Nobles bowed and smiled and complimented his estate, his horses, his late wife's grace and gentleness, but nobody ever questioned his worth to his face, not once in 5 years of careful, controlled silence following him through every gathering he attended without fail. "I did not ask for an opinion," he said. "And yet I gave you one freely," she answered. "That is the difference between us. I do not wait for permission to speak the truth, even when silence would serve me far better in moments such as this one." A young man near the refreshment table chuckled softly, quickly silencing himself when the Duke's eyes flicked toward him sharply. His name was Barnaby Thistlewood, a distant cousin of the Duke's, and he had spent the entire evening watching this unfolding scene with growing delight he could barely contain. He had never witnessed anyone speak to the Duke this way, and survive the conversation without an icy dismissal, following immediately afterward. "Come," the Duke said suddenly, offering his arm again with a formality that did not quite match the intensity still lingering in his expression. "Your gown needs attention before the other guests turn this into gossip for the entire county to feast upon for weeks to come." "It already is gossip," Serafina said, though she took his arm regardless, her fingers settling lightly against the fine fabric of his coat sleeve. "You cannot stop a story once it has started rolling, Your Grace. You can only decide how it ends, and that decision matters far more than pretending the story never began at all." They walked together toward the manor's side entrance, away from the prying eyes of the courtyard, though several pairs of eyes followed them anyway, unwilling to release such an unexpected spectacle so easily. One belonged to the older woman who had whispered earlier, her expression now sharpened into something closer to suspicion than mere curiosity. Another belonged to a young woman standing near the garden wall, watching the Duke walk away with a stranger covered in mud, her own posture stiffening as something cold settled visibly across her features. Her name was Miss Ottilie Brackenridge, and she had expected an announcement that evening, one that would have secured her own place beside the Duke for years to come. Instead, she watched that expectation crumble in real time before an audience that would not soon forget what they witnessed. Inside the manor, away from curious ears and prying eyes, the Duke called for his housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Pruitt, who arrived promptly with clothes and a basin of water, without asking a single question aloud. She had served this house long enough to know better than to question why the Duke had brought a muddy stranger through the side corridor, rather than the main hall reserved for proper guests. "Sit," the Duke instructed, gesturing toward a chair positioned near the crackling fireplace, its warmth already reaching toward them from across the room. Serafina sat, though she kept her chin high, refusing to appear like a wounded creature, accepting charity she had not requested. "I did not ask for your help." "You did not need to ask," he said evenly. "A Duke who watches a woman bleed without offering aid deserves every word of judgment you gave him outside, and I have no intention of proving your words correct twice in a single evening." She almost smiled at that, the corner of her mouth twitching, despite her efforts to remain composed. "So my words did mean something to you after all." He did not answer immediately. Instead, he watched Mrs. Pruitt clean the small cut along Serafina's chin with practiced efficiency, his expression unreadable, though something behind his eyes had shifted noticeably since the courtyard. 2 years of silence and control, 2 years of careful distance maintained from every woman his mother and advisers paraded before him, hoping to secure his attention, and somehow this stranger with mud still drying on her hands had cracked something open with nothing more than a single bold sentence, spoken without hesitation. "Tell me your name properly," he said, watching her closely. "I know you only as the woman who fell from a broken carriage in front of half this county." "Serafina Whitmore," she said. daughter of the late Viscount Whitmore, niece to a woman who warned me never to come tonight at all." "She was right to warn you," the Duke said quietly, his gaze dropping briefly toward the fire before returning to her face. "She was right. That you carry a reputation worth discussing," Serafina corrected gently. "She was wrong if she believed I would run from it the moment I encountered it directly." Mrs. Pruitt finished her work and quietly excused herself from the room, leaving the two of them alone with the crackling fireplace and the distant sound of music still drifting from the courtyard outside, faint and muffled through thick walls. Neither of them moved to rejoin the celebration, still continuing without them. "Why did you come tonight?" the Duke asked, settling into the chair across from her. "My aunt insisted I find a suitable match before this season ends entirely," Serafina admitted. "She fears I will become an old maid, forgotten and unwanted, passed over by every family seeking a proper match for their sons." "And do you fear that outcome yourself?" She considered the question carefully before answering, weighing her words with the same deliberate honesty she had shown him outside in the mud. "I fear becoming someone I am not, far more than I fear being unwanted by anyone unwilling to accept me as I truly am. I would rather stand alone with my voice intact than bow beside a man who silences me simply because silence proves more convenient for him." Worth more than any ring he could offer in exchange for her silence. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending a small shower of sparks upward, and the sound seemed to pull him back into the present moment. He studied her a while longer, as though committing the shape of her face to memory before standing. "You should rest before returning home," he said. "The hour grows late, and the road outside this county is not always kind to travelers after dark. Are you offering me shelter, Your Grace, or simply trying to keep gossip contained beneath your own roof a little longer?" "Perhaps both," he admitted, the faintest trace of something like amusement touching his voice for the first time that evening. "Though I suspect neither reason would satisfy you fully." "You suspect correctly," she said, rising from the chair despite his suggestion. "I will return home tonight. My aunt already worries enough without adding a night spent beneath a duke's roof to her list of concerns." He did not argue further, though he walked her to the front entrance himself, past curious servants, who quickly busied themselves elsewhere the moment his eyes passed over them. At the door, he paused. "This conversation is not finished," he said. "I did not assume it was," Serafina answered, stepping out into the cool night air. "Truth rarely finishes itself in a single evening, Your Grace." Word of the muddy Duchess and her bold tongue spread through the county, faster than any official engagement announcement could have managed on its own. By morning, servants in 3 separate households were whispering about the woman who dared question the Duke of Hallowmere's worth to his face and somehow lived to tell of it without consequence, following swiftly afterward. Serafina returned home before sunrise, her aunt waiting at the door with arms crossed tightly, and worry etched deep into every line of her face. "You spoke to him," her aunt said. It was not a question requiring confirmation. "I spoke to everyone who would listen," Serafina replied, removing her ruined gown's outer shawl with careful, unhurried movements. "He simply happened to be standing closest when I had the most to say. This is not amusing, Serafina. Men like the Duke of Hallowmere do not forget insults easily. They remember, and they find quiet ways to make women regret their boldness long after the moment itself has passed." "Then he will find I am not so easily made to regret anything," Serafina said, climbing the stairs toward her room, without further argument trailing behind her. Meanwhile, across the county, the Duke sat alone in his study, long after his guests departed, staring at a letter he had been avoiding for weeks already. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, had written demanding he choose a bride before the year's end. reminding him sharply that the family name could not survive another scandal, another whispered theory about why his wives never lived long enough to bear him an heir worth celebrating. He had nearly signed papers to formalize his engagement to Miss Ottilie Brackenridge that very evening, a quiet, agreeable young woman who never questioned him, never challenged him, never made him feel anything beyond mild comfort, settled deep in routine. Yet after meeting Serafina, the idea of marrying someone so easily silenced felt suddenly unbearable in a way he could not fully explain even to himself. His cousin Barnaby found him there near midnight, still staring at unsigned papers scattered across his desk. "You are thinking of her," Barnaby said, settling into a chair across from him without waiting for an invitation. "I am thinking of many things," the Duke replied. "You are thinking of the woman who fell from a carriage and dared to call you unworthy of bowing in front of half the county," Barnaby said, grinning widely. "I have never seen anyone speak to you that way and walk away afterward without consequence." "She is reckless. She is honest," Barnaby corrected gently. "There is a difference, cousin, though I suspect you already know it well enough by now." The Duke said nothing, though his silence spoke louder than any argument could have managed on its own. The following afternoon, an invitation arrived at the Whitmore household, sealed with the Duke's own crest pressed firmly into dark wax. Serafina's aunt nearly fainted reading it aloud at the breakfast table, her hands shaking as she clutched the parchment tightly. "You must accept," her aunt insisted, pressing the letter back into Serafina's hands. "This could change everything for our family's standing in this county." "I will accept, because I wish to see if he learned anything from our conversation," Serafina said. "Not because a title impresses me more than honesty does." When she arrived at Hallowmere Estate that afternoon, she found the garden filled with familiar and unfamiliar faces alike, all gathered beneath careful arrangements of late summer blooms. An older woman sat near the fountain, watching with the same calculating patience she had shown the night before, her eyes following every movement across the garden with practiced precision. Miss Ottilie Brackenridge stood stiffly near the roses, her expression carefully neutral, though her eyes followed Serafina's every step, with quiet suspicion she could not fully hide. The Duke greeted Serafina himself, walking away from his other guests without apology to anyone watching closely. "You came. You invited me," she said simply. "I am not in the habit of ignoring invitations from men who still owe me an honest answer to a question asked plainly." "You still want that answer?" "I want many answers, Your Grace. That happens to be the first one I asked, and I rarely forget questions left unanswered for long." He led her toward a quieter section of the garden, away from listening ears, though Miss Brackenridge's eyes burned steadily into both their backs as they walked further from the gathering. Serafina noticed this but said nothing aloud. She understood enough about courtship games to recognize jealousy when she saw it clearly, though she refused to let it shape her own behavior or words. "I did not deserve their bowing," the Duke finally admitted, once they stood beneath a willow tree far from the others gathered near the fountain. "Not that night. Perhaps not for many nights before it either, if I am honest with myself for once." Serafina turned to face him fully, surprised by the honesty carried so plainly in his voice. "Why admit that now?" "Because you are the only person in years who asked me a question, instead of offering me a compliment dressed carefully in flattery," he said. "Everyone around me speaks carefully, calculating each word for how it might benefit them later. You spoke recklessly, without calculation, and somehow that felt more valuable than every careful word I have heard in 5 years combined." "Careful words protect people from consequences," Serafina said. "I simply decided long ago that protecting myself from consequences mattered less than protecting my own voice from disappearing entirely." Their conversation might have continued longer had the older woman from the fountain not approached with poorly disguised curiosity, interrupting with a comment about the weather that fooled nobody standing nearby. The Duke excused himself politely, though his eyes lingered on Serafina a moment longer than etiquette strictly required of him. That evening, as Serafina prepared to leave the estate, A folded note found its way into her gloved hand, slipped there by a young servant girl who disappeared quickly before Serafina could ask any questions of her. She opened it once safely inside her carriage, reading words written in hurried, uneven handwriting that pressed deep into the paper. Leave Hallowmere before the Duke chooses you. You do not understand what happened to the women before you, and you will not survive learning it the way they did. Serafina read the note 3 times, her heart pounding harder with each careful reading, yet her resolve did not waver even slightly. If anything, the warning only sharpened her curiosity about exactly what truth this town had been hiding, behind careful smiles and quiet whispers about a duke who buried 2 wives without anyone daring to ask why aloud. The note stayed hidden inside Serafina's glove for 3 days before she dared show it to anyone. She chose her aunt last, knowing the older woman would either burn it immediately or lock her inside the house until the season ended entirely. "This proves everything I feared," her aunt said, hands trembling as she read the warning again. "Serafina, you must withdraw from his company before this goes further. This proves nothing, except that someone wants me afraid," Serafina replied, taking the note back. "Fear is not proof. It is only a weapon someone hoped would work on me." Her aunt did not argue further, though worry never left her face for the rest of that week. She watched Serafina from doorways and corridors, as though expecting her niece to vanish the moment her back was turned. Serafina noticed this quiet surveillance but said nothing, choosing instead to let her aunt's fear settle quietly, rather than feed it further with arguments neither of them would win. Serafina kept the note's existence secret from the Duke himself, choosing instead to study everyone around him with sharper eyes. She noticed how the servants lowered their voices whenever his late wives were mentioned, exchanging glances that carried more meaning than words ever could. She noticed how Mrs. Pruitt's hands shook slightly whenever she passed the portrait gallery on the 2nd floor, where 2 painted women stared down with serene, unreadable expressions, their painted eyes following visitors, like silent witnesses to a history nobody wished to repeat aloud. She noticed how Lady Calloway always seemed to appear wherever Serafina and the Duke happened to be speaking privately, as though tracking their every movement for someone else's benefit, her presence never quite accidental, despite her practiced air of casual interest. It was Barnaby Thistlewood who finally gave her a thread worth pulling. "You are asking questions," he said one afternoon, finding her alone near the estate's library, while the Duke attended to matters with his steward. "I have watched you do it for days now. You think something happened to his first 2 wives that nobody wishes to discuss. Did something happen?" Serafina asked directly, abandoning any pretense of subtlety. Barnaby glanced around before answering, lowering his voice, as though the very walls of the library might carry his words further than intended. "The first wife, Lady Marjorie, died of a fever that took her within a single week. Sudden, but not unheard of in those days when illness moved quickly through even the strongest households. The second wife, Lady Beatrix, fell from her horse during a morning ride alone, though she rarely rode without a companion before that particular day. She had always preferred company on her rides, laughter and conversation trailing behind her like a second shadow, until that one morning when she insisted on solitude. "Alone," Serafina repeated, turning the word over carefully. "Why would a duchess ride alone if she normally did not?" "That is the question nobody has answered," Barnaby said. "My cousin grieved both deaths deeply, Serafina. Whatever you suspect, do not mistake his silence for guilt. I have known him since childhood, since before he carried this title and all its burdens upon his shoulders. He does not have cruelty in him, only carefulness built from loss after loss, a wall built brick by brick from grief he never properly allowed himself to release." Serafina absorbed this information slowly, turning it over in her mind, like a stone she could not quite identify, its weight uncertain until she understood its shape fully. If the Duke himself was innocent of whatever happened, then someone else within this household or this county carried the weight of two deaths nobody wished to question, a guilt hidden carefully beneath polite smiles and careful conversation. That evening, the Duke requested her presence for dinner, a smaller affair than the garden gathering, attended only by his mother, the Dowager Duchess Brockwell, Barnaby, and Miss Ottilie Brackenridge, who had clearly not given up her claim on the Duke's attention, despite recent events that should have discouraged anyone with less determination. The Dowager Duchess studied Serafina throughout the meal, with the same calculating patience Lady Calloway often displayed, though her words remained polite, even warm at moments, her eyes missing nothing as conversation drifted between topics of little consequence. "You have quite the reputation already," the Dowager said, setting down her glass with deliberate slowness. "My son rarely brings attention to anyone so quickly. In 5 years, I have not seen him speak of a woman the way he has spoken of you these past weeks." "I did not seek attention, Your Grace," Serafina replied evenly. "I simply refused to disappear quietly when given the chance to speak my mind honestly." Dinner, though her eyes followed every exchange between Serafina and the Duke with growing tension, her fork moving slowly across her plate, while her appetite seemed to abandon her entirely. When the meal ended and guests began moving toward the drawing room, she found a moment to pull Serafina aside near the corridor, her grip firm on Serafina's arm. "You think you understand what you are stepping into," Miss Brackenridge said quietly, her voice tight with something between warning and resentment that she could no longer fully disguise. "You do not. I have known this family for years, long before you arrived covered in mud, and somehow captured attention that took others far longer to earn. Honestly, the women who come too close to him do not always leave whole." "Are you threatening me or warning me?" Serafina asked directly, refusing to let her voice waver, despite the chill creeping along her spine. "I am telling you what I know," Miss Brackenridge said. "Whether you call that a threat or a warning depends entirely on what you choose to do with it, and whether you possess the wisdom to listen before it becomes too late for listening to matter at all." She walked away before Serafina could press further, her skirts disappearing around the corner, leaving behind more questions than answers, and an unease that settled deep into Serafina's chest, like a stone dropped into still water. Later that night, after the other guests departed, the Duke found Serafina standing alone in the portrait gallery, studying the painted faces of his 2 former wives beneath the soft glow of candlelight that flickered against old wooden frames. "You came to see them," he said, joining her quietly, his footsteps soft against the polished floor. "I came to understand them," Serafina corrected, not turning away from the portraits. "Lady Marjorie and Lady Beatrix. Tell me about them honestly, not the version everyone repeats at dinner parties, polished smooth from years of careful retelling." The Duke was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the portraits, as though seeing them fresh after years of avoiding this very gallery entirely, his reflection faintly visible in the glass protecting each painted face. "Marjorie was gentle," he finally said, his voice low and measured. "Too gentle, perhaps. She agreed with everything I said, never argued, never pushed back against any decision I made on her behalf. I thought that meant peace. I learned too late. It only meant silence, and silence is not the same as happiness, no matter how convincingly it wears that disguise. And Beatrix? Beatrix wanted to be seen as more than a duchess. She wanted adventure, freedom, things this title rarely allows a woman to claim for herself without judgment, following close behind. I gave her permission to ride alone, because I believed restricting her further would only break something already fragile inside her, something I feared losing entirely if I held too tightly." His voice grew quieter, almost a whisper against the candlelight. "She never returned from that ride." "Do you believe it was an accident?" Serafina asked carefully, watching the way his shoulders tensed at the question. "I believed it for 2 years," he said. "Until recently, when certain things began suggesting otherwise, small details that never quite settled comfortably into the story everyone accepted so easily. Serafina turned to face him fully, her heart quickening. What things? Before he could answer, a sharp knock interrupted them. Mrs. Pruitt appeared at the gallery entrance, her face pale and her hands clasped tightly before her. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion, but a letter arrived for you marked urgent. The messenger insisted you read it tonight, before the household retired for the evening." The Duke took the sealed letter, breaking it open while Serafina watched his expression shift from confusion to something colder, harder, a tightening around his eyes that had not been there moments before. "What does it say?" she asked, stepping closer. He handed it to her wordlessly. The handwriting matched the note Serafina had received days earlier, the same hurried, uneven script pressed deep into the paper, as though written in haste and fear. "The next one will not survive a simple fall. Send her away before the harvest moon, or watch history repeat itself, exactly as it did before." Serafina's hands tightened around the letter, though her voice remained steady when she spoke. "I received something similar 3 days ago." The Duke's head snapped toward her, an alarm flashing openly across his features for the first time since she had known him. "You said nothing. I did not wish to give the warning power it had not yet earned," she said firmly. "But this changes things. Whoever wrote this knows about Beatrix's fall in detail. Few people outside this household would ever know. Details that were never spoken of publicly. Show me your letter," he said urgently, his voice carrying an edge she had not heard from him before. Serafina retrieved it from where she had hidden it among her belongings, and together they compared the 2 notes beneath the gallery's flickering candlelight, holding them side by side against the dim glow. The handwriting matched exactly, confirming what both already suspected with growing dread. Someone close to this household, someone with access to private histories and personal movements that no outsider could possibly know, was responsible for both warnings. Who else knew the details of Beatrix's accident? Serafina asked, her mind already racing through every face she had encountered since arriving at this estate. "Few people," the Duke admitted, pacing slowly before the portraits, as though seeking answers from the painted eyes above them. "Mrs. Pruitt, Barnaby, my mother, and—" He paused, his expression darkening considerably. "Miss Brackenridge. She and Beatrix were close friends before the accident, inseparable in those early years before everything changed so suddenly. She knew everything about that morning, including the unusual circumstances surrounding Beatrix riding alone, details she alone among the household staff and family would have remembered so clearly. You suspect her?" Serafina pressed, though part of her already anticipated the answer given everything Miss Brackenridge had said earlier that same evening. "I do not wish to suspect anyone without proof," he said carefully, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But the timing of her warning to you tonight, combined with this letter's arrival, troubles me deeply. Too many threads pull toward the same uncomfortable conclusion. They agreed to proceed cautiously, watching rather than accusing, gathering proof before making any move that could destroy reputations unjustly or send accusations flying without solid ground beneath them." Over the following days, Serafina found herself drawn deeper into the household's quiet rhythms, observing servants, guests, and family members with careful attention she had never needed before arriving at Hallowmere. It was Mrs. Pruitt who eventually revealed the next piece of the puzzle, finding Serafina alone in the garden one morning, with an expression of someone carrying a burden too heavy to hold silently any longer, her hands twisting nervously at the edges of her apron as she approached. "I should have spoken years ago," Mrs. Pruitt admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, despite the empty garden around them. "Lady Beatrix came to me the morning of her accident, frightened, though she would not say why clearly. Her words rushed and scattered, like someone who feared being overheard, even in private conversation. She mentioned someone had been sending her notes too, similar threats, warning her to leave the estate before something terrible happened to her. "Did she say who sent them?" Serafina asked, her pulse quickening with each new detail. She suspected Miss Brackenridge, though she had no proof beyond instinct, and a feeling she could not quite explain in words, Mrs. Pruitt said. Lady Beatrix believed Miss Brackenridge wanted the Duke for herself, long before any formal courtship began between him and Lady Marjorie, let alone the courtship that followed afterward, with Lady Beatrix herself. She said there was something in the way Miss Brackenridge watched them both, something patient and waiting, like a woman counting days until her own turn finally arrived. Serafina absorbed this slowly, pieces clicking together with uncomfortable clarity, each new fact settling into place, like a missing portion of a larger picture finally taking shape. If Miss Brackenridge had wanted the Duke's attention for years, watching two wives come and go while she waited patiently in the background, her sudden warnings to Serafina took on a far more sinister meaning than simple concern for a stranger's safety. That evening, the Duke called a small gathering under the pretense of discussing autumn harvest preparations, though his true purpose was far more calculated and far more dangerous than anyone in attendance realized at first. He invited Miss Brackenridge, Lady Calloway, Barnaby, and Serafina, watching each carefully for any sign of guilt or discomfort that might slip through the careful masks everyone wore so well in polite company. Lady Calloway arrived first, settling into her usual chair near the fireplace, with practiced ease, her fan moving slowly, though the evening carried little warmth requiring such cooling. Miss Brackenridge arrived last, her expression composed, though Serafina noticed her eyes flicker toward the Duke, with something unreadable beneath the surface calm, something that looked almost like fear hiding behind careful composure. "I received a troubling letter recently," the Duke announced once everyone settled, his voice carefully neutral despite the tension visible in the set of his jaw. "Someone within this circle appears determined to frighten Miss Whitmore away from this estate, using threats eerily similar to warnings my late wife Beatrix received before her accident those years ago." The room fell silent, the only sound the soft crackle of the fire and the distant call of an owl somewhere beyond the windows. Lady Calloway's composure cracked slightly, her eyes darting toward Miss Brackenridge before she could stop herself, a reaction quick enough that only Serafina's watchful gaze caught it fully. "You suspect one of us," Miss Brackenridge said, her voice tight, her hands clasped so firmly together that her knuckles had gone pale. "I suspect whoever wrote these letters," the Duke corrected calmly. "I simply wish to understand why someone would threaten an innocent woman's safety for reasons that benefit no one, honestly, reasons that only deepen suspicion rather than easing it." Barnaby, watching the exchange carefully from his seat near the window, finally spoke into the heavy silence. "Perhaps the benefit is not financial or social, but personal. Perhaps someone has waited years for an opportunity that keeps slipping away each time the Duke considers remarriage, an opportunity that feels closer to slipping away entirely, with every passing season." Miss Brackenridge stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, the sound sharp enough to make Lady Calloway flinch visibly. "You are accusing me. Nobody has named you directly," the Duke said calmly, though his eyes never left her face, steady and unwavering, despite the storm building visibly behind Miss Brackenridge's own expression. "You did not need to name me," she said, her voice rising with emotion she could no longer contain within the careful boundaries she had maintained for years. "Everyone in this room already decided I am the villain in this story, simply because I dared care for you longer than either of your wives managed, before their convenient deaths interrupted whatever future they imagined for themselves." The room grew tense, every guest holding their breath at the raw confession beginning to spill from Miss Brackenridge's lips, like water finally breaking through a dam, too long strained against pressure. "I loved you before Marjorie ever arrived," she continued, tears forming despite her visible attempts to remain composed before an audience she had once considered allies. "I watched you marry her, grieve her, then marry Beatrix barely a year later, and I told myself, Patience would eventually earn what loyalty deserved after enough seasons passed quietly. But patience earns nothing in this world. Boldness does. Recklessness does. Her eyes flicked toward Serafina, with something between hatred and desperation, raw and unguarded for the first time since they had met. She arrived, covered in mud, and dared speak to you as an equal, and within weeks, you looked at her the way you never once looked at me, in 5 years of careful devotion that counted for absolutely nothing in the end. "Did you write these letters?" the Duke asked, directly, his voice quiet but unwavering, cutting through her emotion like a blade through silk. Miss Brackenridge hesitated, her chest rising and falling rapidly, as though she had run a great distance rather than simply spoken aloud. "I wrote the warning to Miss Whitmore. I wanted her gone before she took something I waited years to earn, through patience nobody else seemed to value or notice." "And the letter sent to me tonight?" he pressed, leaning forward slightly. "The one referencing Beatrix's fall specifically, with details that should have remained buried with her." "I did not write that one," she said, confusion flickering across her face for the first time, genuine surprise replacing the desperation that had colored her words moments before. "I swear to you, I only sent the warning meant to frighten her away from this house, and from you. I never threatened harm, beyond words meant only to push her toward leaving on her own accord." Serafina watched this confession unfold with growing unease, settling deeper into her chest. If Miss Brackenridge spoke truthfully, then someone else entirely, someone still hidden within this household, had written the second letter, referencing details about Beatrix's death that should have remained private knowledge, known only to a select few. Lady Calloway's hands trembled slightly in her lap, though nobody else seemed to notice, except Serafina, whose sharp eyes had learned to watch every small reaction in this house of careful secrets, and whose instincts now whispered that the true danger had not yet revealed itself fully within these walls. Lady Calloway's trembling hands did not go unnoticed for long. The Duke turned slowly, his gaze settling on her with the same quiet weight he had given Miss Brackenridge only moments before. "You have said nothing this entire evening," he said, "yet your hands tell a different story than your silence." Lady Calloway forced a smile, though it did not reach her eyes. "I am simply troubled by such accusations, flying across my friend's reputation, Your Grace. Anyone in this room would tremble, witnessing such a painful confession unfold before them." "Perhaps," the Duke said. "Or perhaps your trembling has nothing to do with sympathy at all." Serafina watched the exchange closely, her instincts sharpening with every passing second. She thought back to every moment Lady Calloway had appeared near her and the Duke during private conversations. Every glance exchanged too quickly to seem accidental, every comment offered with careful timing, designed to steer attention elsewhere. Pieces that once seemed unrelated now arranged themselves into something far more deliberate. "You knew Lady Beatrix well," Serafina said suddenly, the realization forming even as she spoke it aloud. "Better than you ever admitted." Lady Calloway's composure slipped further. "We were acquainted, as most ladies of standing are, within this county. Acquainted is not the same as knowing someone's habits well enough to write a letter describing the exact manner of her death," Serafina pressed. Miss Brackenridge admitted she only sent warnings meant to frighten. She did not write tonight's letter. Yet someone in this room clearly did. Someone who knew details intimate enough to recreate that morning with chilling accuracy. The room fell into a silence, so heavy it seemed to press against the walls themselves. Barnaby leaned forward slightly, his earlier amusement long gone, replaced now with sharp attention. The Dowager Duchess, who had remained quiet throughout the entire confrontation, set down her cup with deliberate care, her eyes fixed on Lady Calloway, with an intensity that suggested old suspicions finally surfacing, after years buried beneath polite conversation. "I think it is time you explained yourself," the Duke said, his voice low and dangerous, in a way Serafina had not heard from him before. Lady Calloway's hands twisted in her lap, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the weight of every eye fixed upon her. "You do not understand what it cost me, watching this family rise while mine fell into ruin around us. My husband lost everything, investing in ventures your father once promised support for. Support that vanished the moment it became inconvenient for your family's reputation. We lost our estate. We lost our standing. I watched my own daughters grow up with nothing, while this household continued its endless parade of weddings and mourning gowns and grand celebrations, as though the world owed you endless second chances. So you destroyed 2 innocent women to settle a debt that was never theirs to pay," the Duke said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "I did not plan Marjorie's fever," Lady Calloway said quickly, though her voice wavered with the admission. "That illness took her on its own. But I will admit, watching her suffer without intervening felt like the first small justice I had tasted in years. As for Beatrix, she trusted me. She told me everything, including her plans to ride alone that morning to clear her mind before an argument with you that she feared greatly. I simply suggested she take the path along the eastern ridge, knowing the loose stones there had caused trouble for other riders before. I did not push her myself. I only placed her somewhere fate could finish what I started." Serafina felt sick listening to such calculated cruelty, delivered with such calm precision, as though discussing nothing more significant than weather patterns or seasonal harvests. "And tonight's letter? The one warning the Duke about history repeating itself." "A reminder," Lady Calloway said, lifting her chin slightly, defiance returning to her voice, now that her secret had finally surfaced. "I wanted him to understand that bringing another woman into this house carries consequences, that some debts never truly disappear, no matter how many seasons pass." "You threatened my life," Serafina said, her voice steady despite the chill running through her entirely. "I threatened a stranger who arrived covered in mud and somehow charmed her way into a position my own daughters deserved far more than you." Lady Calloway snapped. "Why should you receive everything so easily when better women suffer and lose everything before you ever arrive?" The Duke stood slowly, his expression carved from stone. "Guards," he called, his voice carrying clearly through the manor's corridors. 2 men appeared promptly, summoned by years of training that anticipated such moments even in households that rarely required such measures. "Lady Calloway will remain under watch until proper authorities arrive to address what she has confessed tonight, before witnesses." Lady Calloway did not resist as the guards approached, though her eyes remained fixed on Serafina with a mixture of resentment and something almost like relief, the relief of secrets finally spoken aloud after years of carrying their weight alone. Once she had been led away, the room remained heavy, with the aftermath of revelations nobody had anticipated walking into that evening. Miss Brackenridge sat quietly in her chair, tears still drying on her face, though her earlier desperation had transformed into something closer to shame. "I should have suspected her sooner," she said quietly. "Beatrix mentioned feeling watched in her final weeks, though she never named anyone directly. I assumed grief and worry colored her perception unfairly. I never imagined someone within our own circle could be responsible for such cruelty." "None of us imagined it," the Dowager Duchess said, breaking her long silence at last. "I watched Beatrix grow anxious in those final weeks, and attributed it to nerves any new bride might feel, adjusting to this household's expectations. I failed to look closer, when looking closer might have saved her life." The Duke moved toward Serafina, his expression softening slightly, despite the heaviness still hanging over the room. "You uncovered what nobody else managed to uncover, in 2 years of quiet suspicion and unanswered questions. I simply refuse to accept warnings as reasons to stop asking questions," Serafina said. "Fear convinces people to look away. I have never found looking away particularly useful." Miss Brackenridge rose from her chair, composing herself with visible effort. "Your Grace, I understand if my own confession tonight changes how you view me. I sent warnings born from jealousy and desperation, behavior unbecoming of someone claiming genuine affection. I will accept whatever consequences you believe appropriate." The Duke considered her for a long moment. "Your actions caused fear, Miss Brackenridge, and fear is not something I dismiss lightly, given everything this household has endured. However, you did not cause harm beyond words, and you confessed honestly when given the opportunity to remain silent instead. I will not pursue punishment beyond requesting you reflect seriously on the difference between longing for something and believing you deserve to claim it through manipulation." Miss Brackenridge nodded, tears returning briefly before she excused herself quietly from the room, leaving behind a silence that felt different from the tension preceding it, lighter somehow, though still heavy with everything revealed that night. Barnaby exhaled slowly, breaking the remaining tension with a small, tired laugh. "I believe this counts as the most eventful harvest preparation discussion this family has ever hosted." Despite everything, Serafina found herself almost smiling at his timing, grateful for even a small moment of relief after the intensity of revelations still settled around them all. News of Lady Calloway's confession spread through the county within days, scandal rippling through drawing rooms and dinner parties with far greater intensity than any rumor about mud or fallen carriages had managed earlier that season. Some families distanced themselves quickly from any association with her name, while others whispered with morbid fascination about a woman capable of such patient, calculated cruelty, hidden beneath decades of polite smiles. Serafina remained at Hallowmere in the days following the confrontation, partly because authorities required her statement regarding both threatening letters, and partly because something had shifted between her and the Duke that neither seemed willing to name directly yet. She found him one morning standing near the same willow tree where he had first admitted he did not deserve the bowing given to him that fateful night at the ball. "You have been quiet since everything settled," she said, approaching slowly. "I have been thinking," he admitted, "about Marjorie, about Beatrix, about how easily I accepted explanations that should have demanded closer examination. I called myself protective, careful, responsible. In truth, I was simply afraid of looking too closely at anything that might break the careful order I built around myself after losing them both." "Grief does that to people," Serafina said gently. "It convinces us that distance protects us from further pain, when sometimes distance only delays understanding we eventually need anyway." "You did not maintain distance," he said, turning to face her fully. "You arrived covered in mud, asked questions nobody else dared ask, and uncovered a truth that 2 years of careful grieving never managed to reveal." "I did not arrive seeking truth," Serafina said honestly. "I arrived because my aunt insisted I find a suitable match, and I happened to fall from a broken carriage in front of the very man she warned me about most strongly." "Do you regret that fall now, knowing everything it led toward?" Serafina considered the question seriously before answering. "I regret that Beatrix and Marjorie never received the chance I have been given, the chance to question things, to push back, to demand honesty rather than accepting careful silence. I do not regret anything that brought their story into the light, even if the path toward that truth began with something as undignified as mud and a broken carriage wheel." The Duke studied her for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them, beneath the willow's swaying branches. "My mother believes I should formally court you, properly, with the kind of patience and tradition this family has always valued." "And what do you believe?" Serafina asked. "I believe tradition failed Marjorie and Beatrix both," he said. "I believe patience without honesty only buried problems deeper rather than solving them. I do not wish to court you through careful tradition that rewards silence over truth. I wish to know you as you truly are, questions and boldness included, without pretending those qualities are flaws requiring correction." "Then ask me properly," Serafina said, without careful tradition shaping every word. The Duke took a slow breath, his usual composure softening into something far more vulnerable than Serafina had witnessed from him before. "Serafina Whitmore, I do not offer you safety, because I cannot promise a world free from danger or scandal, given everything this family has endured. I do not offer you silence, because I have learned silence costs more than honesty ever could. I offer you honesty, partnership, and a voice equal to my own in every decision that shapes our future together, should you wish to build that future beside me." Serafina felt something settle within her chest, warm and certain, despite everything frightening that had unfolded across recent weeks. Breaking through his careful restraint. "It is the beginning of one," Serafina said. "I will not bow simply because tradition expects it. If we build something together, it will be built on equal footing, honest words, and the freedom to question everything, including each other, whenever necessary." "I would not want it built any other way," the Duke said. Word of their understanding spread quickly, though this time the whispers carried warmth rather than suspicion. The Dowager Duchess, initially cautious about her son's unconventional choice, found herself softening considerably after witnessing how thoroughly Serafina had protected this family from threats nobody else managed to identify across 2 years of quiet mourning. Months later, as autumn settled fully across the county and harvest celebrations filled the air with music and laughter once again, Serafina stood beside the Duke during a public gathering remarkably similar to the ball where everything began. This time, no carriage wheel broke beneath her, no mud stained her gown. Yet she still found herself speaking honestly to those gathered around her, refusing every pressure to soften her words simply because tradition expected quiet agreement from a future Duchess. Barnaby raised his glass during the evening's festivities, grinning widely as he addressed the gathered crowd. "To the only woman in this county bold enough to question whether my cousin deserved any bowing at all, and clever enough to uncover the truth that protected this family from repeating tragedy a third time." "My jealousy nearly cost you safety you did not deserve to lose. Watching you both now, I understand finally what genuine affection looks like, the kind built on honesty, rather than quiet waiting and desperate hope." "Thank you for confessing honestly when it mattered most," Serafina said. "That honesty helped uncover truth that protected us both, in different ways." As the evening continued, Serafina found a quiet moment alone with the Duke near the same fountain, where Lady Calloway once sat, watching everything with calculating patience. The fountain still flowed steadily, indifferent to everything that had unfolded around it across recent months. "Do you think Marjorie and Beatrix would have wanted this for you?" Serafina asked softly. Happiness built from truths their own stories helped reveal. "I believe they would have wanted exactly this," the Duke said. "Someone bold enough to ask the questions they never had the chance to ask themselves. Someone who refused to let fear silence truth, the way circumstances once silenced them both." Serafina looked toward the gathered crowd, toward Barnaby's easy laughter and the Dowager Duchess speaking warmly with guests who once doubted her son's unconventional choice entirely. She thought about the broken carriage wheel that started everything, about mud and bold laughter, and a question asked without permission that changed the course of 2 lives forever. Would you have asked that same bold question, standing covered in mud, before a duke who buried 2 wives without explanation? Would you have trusted your instincts, the way Serafina trusted hers, even when warnings arrived urging silence and retreat instead? Tell me honestly in the comments below, and tell me which part of this story surprised you most, because every twist tonight was built carefully toward this very ending. If this story moved you the way I hope it did, subscribe now, because more duchesses, more dukes, and more truths waiting to be uncovered are coming very soon.